Welcome to this Wednesday lunch at Lowy. I'm Alan Gingell, the Executive Director of the Institute. Thank you for coming out on such a bleak day. It's always a particular pleasure for me to be able to introduce one of my colleagues from the Institute to talk at these lunches, and at this particular moment in time it's a great pleasure to introduce Mark Thirlwell, who's the Director, of course, of the Institute's International Economy Program. Mark is well known, I'm sure, to all of you. He came to the Lowy Institute via Oxford, Cambridge, the Bank of England, JP Morgan's, and the Australian Export, Australian Export Finance and Insurance Corporation. Sorry, they're corporate member. Apologies to EFIC people present. Mark has been following in a series of very interesting papers for the Institute the changing nature of the global economy. In the past 18 months, 2 years, he's written Second Thoughts on Globalization, which was a Lowy Institute paper, More Second Thoughts, which was a follow-up to that. November last year, he published a piece called Crunched, Lessons from the 2007 financial crisis, which I just reread this morning, Mark, and stands up very well. Would that more people had taken notice of you. He's got a paper which will be out very shortly now, called The Spectre of Malthus, Lessons from the 2007-2008 food crisis. So he's been trying for some time now to make sense for us all of what's happening in the world, and it's certain that at this time we need two things. We need to understand how economies work, but especially we need economists who can explain to the rest of us how economies work, and Mark is certainly one of those economists, and it's a great pleasure for me to invite him to explain to us whether we're seeing the end of the free market. Please welcome Mark Thirlwell.
Thanks, Alan, for the kind introduction, and again, thanks to everybody here for turning up on such a really rotten day. It's always good to look out and actually see people in the audience rather than empty seats. So thank you to everybody. I'm going to begin with two disclaimers and an apology. The disclaimers, disclaimers or qualifications. Disclaimer number one is that this kind of discussion and debate often veers into the ideological. So normally I don't bother, but I'll put my priors up front straight away. As Alan mentioned in the intro, I did my economics, amongst other places, at Cambridge in the UK, which of course is the home of what I would describe as the world's the greatest 20th century economist, John Maynard Keynes, and who is, as I've written for our blog recently, newly relevant to the 21st century as well. And sort of Keynesianism, at least at a sort of a very simplistic level, the idea that markets are jolly good things, but that you also need government to save markets and capitalists for themselves periodically, is a good way to think about the world, is a way that I think about the world. It seems to me at the moment quite an obvious way to think about the world, but you might want to filter what I say through that viewpoint. The second disclaimer, and probably the more important one, is that at the moment it's really hard to be definitive about anything because the crisis is still moving. As we've seen, and as Alan mentioned, I was writing about it at the end of 2007, and I went back and reread some of the stuff that I wrote then. And on one level, I was quite pleased with it. I was quite pleased with quite a bit of the diagnosis about what had gone wrong, what some of the challenges were. But on the other, I sort of had the sense of reading this that I really, at that point, still didn't get just how bad this was going to be, just how all-encompassing this was going to turn out to be. And we've seen, again, until recently, we've just seen the latest wave of this as it sort of washed out and started to swamp emerging market economies around the world. And we know that it's still not over. We're still sort of seeing the first rumblings of some of the real economy complications for large chunks of the developed world. So we know that there's stuff still to be seen. The classic analogy of this has always been that the rising tide lifts all boats. So when we had this really good period in the world economy, everything looked like it was going really well. The flip side of that was sort of the Warren Buffett joke that it's only when the tide goes out that you can see who's been swimming naked. So you start to get to see the ugly stuff when the tide goes out. But unfortunately, that analogy isn't quite right. It's not that the tide's gone out. It's much scarier than that, I think. What's happened is this is the point where you've seen the water rush back out. And the reason it's rushed back out is because you've got a bloody great tsunami on its way. And that's coming in really rapidly. And it's storm weather. It's big unstable global weather conditions. And those things swamp boats. And if your boat's not really well built, it's not even just had a small leak, but if it's not really well built, it runs the risk of going under. We've seen a whole lot of boats go under already, and at this point we still don't know which other boats are going to follow. So again, this is sort of very much thinking about what's happening as it happens, and we don't know what the final consequences are. So there's sort of a big qualification there. The apology is just that I don't want us to be too unseemly enthusiastic or seem to I'm enjoying this too much. I mean, this is a really negative, serious event for the world economy. It's going to have all sorts of horrible consequences for a lot of people's livelihoods. But for an economist and for a think tank economist, it's a fascinating time. So at one level, you kind of do almost enjoy it. You know that it's bad, but on the other hand, we're not real scientists. We don't have laboratories where we can do experiments. This is one of the world's greatest real-time economic experiments that we're ever going to see. Certainly one of the greatest that I'm probably likely to see in my lifetime. So watching that play out is a fascinating opportunity. And so I apologize if the enthusiasm gets unseemly, given that at the end of this, what this means is destroyed jobs. People are going to be poorer. People are going to be worse off. But it's just fascinating to watch. This talk, the end of the free market question mark, is based on, or if you can see it as a bit of a sequel to a talk I gave back in March this year. And that talk was called Welcome to the New Global Economy. And the theme that I was running with then was that we'd reached an interesting turning point in the way the world economy works. And that the argument was that beginning in the 1980s with a period of liberalization and then gathering force through the 90s and into the earliest part of this century, we'd seen basically the triumph of the free market, the triumph of global financial capitalism. So if you think about the balance of power between states and governments and markets on the other hand, we've seen this prolonged period where the balance had tilted pretty decisively in favor of the market. And I was making the case back in March, and I've been making it before then, that what we were seeing is a rebalancing, that the world was starting to tilt back in favor of the state, back in favor of governments. The balance of economic power was shifting. And as part of that speech, I played a little game, which was sort of my version of a dating game, which was it's fun to pick dates for when things change. And I sort of said, well, for example, you can have 28 June 1914. This is Sarajevo, the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. That's the start of the First World War. It's the end of the first global economy. We can date it quite precisely. The other date that I played around with, 9 November 1989, fall of the Berlin Wall, start of the new global economy, the triumph of market capitalism. And then I started to have fun, and I was throwing, well, what dates can we think about for a new global economy? And I proposed one, I think, was 2nd April 2007, which is when New Century Financial, at that point the US's second largest subprime lender, files for bankruptcy. And then I had a couple of other suggestions. I think we had August that year when the two Bear Stearns hedge funds went belly up. September when there was the run on Northern Rock, the first run on a British bank since 1866, and then early the following year when you had Northern Rock nationalized. So I was sort of playing around with maybe some of these dates. We now have a stunning new contender that probably pushes all of these aside, and that's 15 September 2008. And that's when the US authorities, perhaps bravely, perhaps foolishly or foolhardily, perhaps with desperate courage, or perhaps just really, really stupidly, let Lehman Brothers go under. And the financial crisis enters a new and much more virulent phase. And within days, you see global financial markets centered around London and New York, but around the globe, basically seizing up, panicking, panic-stricken global financial markets. And the whole system, the whole edifice, teeters. And basically we have an unprecedented response by governments around the world who realize that the ad hoc, partial solutions that they've been trying up until then, tinkering at the sidelines, the occasional bailout, occasional part nationalization, aren't going to be enough. You're going to have to go systemic, and you're going to have to go systemic with, in effect, partial effective nationalizations of your financial system. So there's a temptation, clearly, at that point, to say the world changes on 15th of September. My argument about the rebalancing towards the state, away from the market, case closed. Case has been done. Case has been made. Unfortunately, that would obviously end the lunch far too early, and you'd probably be rightfully a bit disappointed in me. So we'll expand it, and we'll talk a bit more about it. And I think, and there are sort of some interesting wiggles and qualifications to that. But it is pretty clear that the world looks very different now. And one sort of amusing way of thinking about that is the US economist and blogger Brad DeLong has this great line in a recent op-ed, and he says, think about the Bush administration. The Bush administration come in as social conservatives. Because of this effective bailout of large chunks of the US financial system, they're going to leave office as conservative socialists. Not a prediction that you'd have been making about the Bush administration. Or as Hugo Chavez, the president of Venezuela, put it more pithily, Comrade Bush, how are you? he was, he was quite pleased to see that after having been lectured in the past for nationalizing large chunks of the Venezuelan economy, the Americans had finally caught on to the game and were nationalizing chunks of their own as well. Of course, as the way these things work, the spreading of the emerging markets crisis part of this, and including the tanking of commodity prices, means that President Chavez is probably, some of that schadenfreude is now fading as he looks at the consequences of the way the world's going, and I'll come back to some of that later on. But the way the world works changed on September the 15th. The roots of that change, as I've hopefully made clear in other speeches, lay before then. But it's pretty clear if you want to pick a nice date, and we've got a really good candidate now. So how does all this fit in with my general argument about the way that the world shifted, the way it works differently? Well, the old propositions were threefold, and I said I had basically three arguments which have evolved over time and have been captured in various papers about why I think the role of the state was coming back relative to the role of the market. Proposition one was what I've been calling the Great Convergence. And the Great Convergence is basically this idea that emerging markets, and in particular the 2 billion plus emerging markets of China and India, are now experiencing rapid modern economic growth. So you're seeing a gradual convergence in living standards between some of the world's poorer economies and the world's richer economies. And that great convergence, that rebalancing of economic power, if you like, has had geographic consequences. It's tilted the center of world economic power away from the North Atlantic and towards the Asian region. But it's also had consequences in terms of the balance between states and markets. Because whether through ideological reasons or through level of development reasons, this rebalancing of economic power has gone towards countries which have, at least until recently anyway, awarded a relatively greater role to the state in the running of their economies than has been the case in the developed world. So as a consequence of this rebalancing of economic power, you've seen a rebalancing towards the greater role of the state. And if you think about some of the debates that we've been having, at least until the deepening of this crisis, about the rise of sovereign wealth funds, for example, of state-controlled investment, about the role played by state-owned enterprises and state-owned banks, all of those debates basically are a consequence of this global rebalancing of power, or a consequence of this great convergence. So that was reason one for thinking about we're going to have a rebalancing towards the state. Reason two came out of the paper that I wrote called Second Thoughts on Globalization. And the argument here was that if you looked at the developed world, even before this financial crisis, a large number of voters in the United States and in Western Europe in particular were starting to get cold feet about the benefits or alleged benefits of the global economy. They were starting to have second thoughts. There were a range of reasons for this that I talked about, worried about the environmental consequences, worried about what they felt was a linkage between growing inequality at home and rising international economic integration, troubled by the consequences of trade. Some were worried about security implications, others about resource security. There were a whole bunch of reasons for this, but the consequence, or at least I thought one consequence, was likely to be increased demand for governments in the developed world to do something. Now, the something might vary quite a lot. It can vary from, on the one hand, old-fashioned protectionist-style responses, i.e. put up barriers to foreign investment, regulate those sovereign wealth funds, even think about going back to old-style trade protectionism, putting tariffs up against very cheap Chinese imports, through to much more different, but still government involvement, which is sort of creating new regulations for a new global economy, looking for global regulatory responses to what were global economic and environmental challenges, more pressure on things like developing a Kyoto-style response, doing global regulatory standards. And the classic example, or one of the examples that I used, was the idea that people got very worried about quality issues. And we had a range of scares, and we've seen continue through to this year, that people were starting to say, well, if we have made in China stamped on our pet food, or stamped on our children's toys, or on the baby milk, we're worried about the quality of that. If we can't trust Chinese regulators, why should we allow free trade, if you like? Maybe we need global regulatory standards. Of course, the interesting point that we're now in is you can make an analogous argument for US financial instruments. You could say, well, if you see made in the United States stamped metaphorically on the bottom of your financial instrument, you'd now have good reason to believe, well, the regulatory standards there were pretty shocking too. So you again, and the Europeans are making this case already, what you need is global regulatory standards. You need someone to come in and oversee national authorities. If you want to have a global market, you need a global regulatory standard. So in a sense, there are two polar responses to this. Put barriers up and become more protectionist, move back towards national economies, or go more global. Have a more globalized system or a global regulatory system. But either way you went, you're injecting government back into the process. So I thought that was my second reason for thinking we had this tilt back towards government away from the market. The third reason, and the one that I've written about most recently, and that it feeds into the Malthus paper when it comes out, was this sense that we've been moving towards a resource-constrained world economy. As a byproduct of the Great Convergence, as a byproduct of the extremely rapid industrialization and urbanization of some of the world's most populous countries, we're starting to bump up against resource constraints. You can argue a lot about whether these are short-term resource constraints due to inadequate investment, which will be relaxed over the longer term, or whether they're more permanent resource constraints, sort of the peak oil style arguments. But again, whichever side of that argument you pick on, short term the argument was we're bouncing into resource constraints. And the food crisis was a classic example of this in action, and it was a very powerful story of this, which is one of the reasons that I've written about it. And the lesson again that comes out of this is when confronted with resource constraints, governments get very edgy. And the food crisis is a good example of this. If governments can't feed their populations, they're in trouble. At that point, governments have to intervene. The knee-jerk response of governments to the food crisis was more government intervention. Price controls made a comeback. Export bans made a comeback. Governments get involved. But also, if you think about energy as well, here's an area where governments historically have been reluctant to leave it to the market. And what we've seen, for example, if you look out across the energy sector now, if you look at the world's top 10 oil companies by reserves under the ground, all 10 are in government hands. If you look at who controls oil reserves under the ground, I think 80% plus are now controlled by national or state-controlled oil companies. So this idea of a move towards a resource-constrained world, I argued, was also another reason for believing that governments were going to make a comeback. So I had these three stories. And then the financial crisis hits and gets deeper. And at one level, it makes my storytelling much easier. In a sense, we can all see the return of government, and I'll talk a little bit about some of the policy responses we've seen. But at another level, it actually complicates some of these stories as well. And one obvious example for this is the resource-constrained world story. Back in July, if I stood up and told you about a resource-constrained world when oil is at $147 a barrel, everybody will kind of nod at me quite happily and say, yeah, sure, and there are all those forecasts out there saying $200 a barrel, and they look pretty credible too, so we buy that. Now oil's closer to $60 a barrel, and people are talking about a great big commodity bust. The story is much less easy to sell. I will argue that I've been consistent about this throughout the story. If anybody's ever heard me talk about this before, I've basically said two things have gone on in commodity markets. One is a structural shift, a structural demand story, which has been the story of the Great Convergence. And then overlaid on top of that was an almighty cyclical story. And basically what the cyclical story was always going to turn, and what's happened, of course, is the cyclical story has turned. I think the structural story is still there. But such as the depth and the magnitude of the cyclical turn, it could be quite a while before we start to think about the structural drivers again. So that story has been complicated by what's happened, not made easier. So how has the financial crisis played out into my story? Well, the first one is, if you think about the list of casualties from this, and the list of casualties is truly impressive. I mean, starting from New Century Financial, if you just think about financial institutions, what a non-exhaustive list would be New Century Financial at the beginning, Northern Rock, Bear Stearns, Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, Indy Mac, Washington Mutual, Wachovia, Lehman Brothers, Merrill Lynch, HBOS, AIG. The list kind of is nice and long, and that's far from comprehensive. And you can see you can add your own on top of that. But it's gone beyond that. It's gone into economic models. I guess most obviously from that list, the idea of an independent broker-dealer US investment bank is now in the dustbin of history. There aren't any anymore. The big five have all gone in one way or another. They've either gone under or they've reinvented themselves. If you think about the model that's been based on large-scale financial engineering, structured credit products, securitization, and in particular over-the-counter derivatives, a lot of those markets are either severely impaired or completely shut, and there are big question marks over at least whether some of them will ever come back again. Some will, but a lot, it's at the moment anyway, suggests that they won't, and therefore the businesses that were based on those aren't going to come back again either. What about the linkage between rating agencies and regulatory authorities? It now increasingly looks like that the model that we had, whereby on the one hand, regulators relied on the rating agencies to tell them about risk, and at the same time, the rating agencies relied on the guys who were issuing the products to pay their fees for rating them. That model's got to presumably, after this, be in deep question. You'd assume that model is going to be changed, and there's already both sides of the regulators and the litigators going after the agencies. Hedge funds, who haven't been at the heart of this crisis at all. People pointed out, people used to think of hedge funds as the point of great vulnerability. They haven't been at the crisis. Interesting, it looks like they might be victims of the crisis, though. Large-scale withdrawals, as we've seen from spooked investors, and also government bans on short selling, which have certainly not helped the hedge fund's financial model. So the hedge fund model has suffered from this. The model of basically for a lot of second-tier banks and borrowers of funding yourselves overwhelmingly in short-term interbank markets. not relying on having large deposit bases, which is obviously linked to the US investment bank model as well. That model now is up for grab, is under deep question, and certainly markets have been saying that they don't buy that model particularly anymore, at least in the way the world currently works. And you could go further again. You could say, well, what are the other casualties? Well, the other casualties clearly include reputations of a whole range of people. Alan Greenspan, of course, is no longer looking the great financial guru that he used to, and has been holed up in front of the U.S. Congress to explain himself, and issued in at least a form of a mea culpa. The Fed, the U.S. central bank, his reputation is no longer going to look as good as it used to either. I mean, you can make a pretty good case that the argument that the Fed had been pioneering, which was this basically an asymmetric approach to asset bubbles. In other words, you do nothing with that when asset price markets are inflating on the way up, but you stand ready to bail out the economy on the way down. That's turned out to be a recipe for fundamental financial instability. It's pretty hard to see that, A, that argument is still sustainable, and B, the reputation of those that made that argument looks as good as it used to. So another casualty. And the latest range of casualty, of course, is a whole range of emerging markets that have been falling over, including most of the Icelandic banking system and possibly Iceland itself as a country going bankrupt. I remember very early on in the crisis, people used to make the joke about UBS in Switzerland, and they used to say, well, worst case scenario, if UBS goes under, then Switzerland can bail out UBS. The problem is who gets to bail out Switzerland. In the case of Iceland, it's come true. I mean, the Icelandic banking system has gone under, and now it's the IMF that is bailing out Iceland. And of course, this is a fascinating story about of clouds and silver linings. If you go back to my earlier presentations, I was saying one of the ways the world had changed was that the IMF was drifting into terminal irrelevance, particularly in this part of the world. It's a legacy of the Asian financial crisis. Regional lenders wouldn't touch the fund regional countries didn't want to touch the fund with a barge pole. The fund was basically reduced to implementing austerity packages on itself. The world no longer looks that way. The IMF is now bailing out Eastern Europe. You have an IMF package in Iceland, you have an IMF package in Hungary, you have an IMF package in the Ukraine. I think Pakistan are negotiating for one as well. The fund is relevant again. Every cloud has a silver lining. The IMF is now looking undermanned rather than overmanned, and under-resourced rather than over-resourced. So the world has moved again. Who is to blame for this? I mean, if you're thinking about what the implications of the crisis are, then one of them depends on who you point the finger of blame at. And the line I've been using here is that this is very much like your typical Agatha Christie murder mystery. You have a huge list of subjects. And even more so, it's basically like the murder on the Orient Express. So spoiler alert for if there's anybody out there who doesn't know this. I'm sure there can't be very many. And that's that everybody did it. Everybody wielded the murder blade. So you can run down the list. You can say, well, central banks, the US central bank kept monetary policy too easy for too long. Regulators were clearly asleep at their job. The rating agencies were basically not doing their job either, or if they weren't doing it right, their models had broken down and they didn't know really how to price and rate these things. But it's sort of beyond that. I think it's now got to the point where, and Greenspan himself admitted this, where the whole structure, the risk and regulatory structure that had been put in place over the last couple of decades, a market-based, self-regulated or deregulated structure has failed. And it's failed catastrophically, it's failed cataclysmically, and it's failed systemically. It's completely broken down. And under those circumstances, governments are being forced to step in and re-engineer the way financial systems work. In fact, basically, governments are being forced to step in and say, financial markets have failed to be able to price risk effectively. Financial markets have failed to also uphold basic standards of trust. We learn right from your basic economic textbooks about why financial markets are vulnerable. And basically from banks, you don't have to have complicated financial instruments here. You can have simple bank-based story. And there are two big weaknesses here. Weakness number one is the maturity mismatch one. The classic one that we all know. Banks borrow short and lend long. So you have this maturity mismatch. If your depositors decide to make a run on you, you're in trouble. And the second one is the one about trust. Banks are a confidence game. You need trust to be in place. Lenders, borrowers need to have trust in the institutions. The current financial crisis at its heart showed both of those things blowing up again. So we had modern variants of bank runs, except instead of it being depositors running on banks, or we saw that a bit, of course, with Northern Rock, but it's been happening in the interbank market where basically short-term funding was pulled and banks who'd been using the short-term funding to fund long-term assets were immediately into trouble. But more fundamentally still, a complete breakdown of trust. banks refused to lend to each other because they didn't know, they couldn't trust their counterparties. You had a complete failure on counterparty risk. So you had this breakdown in the system, and that brought government back in. And if you look at the list of government responses, as I said, it sort of started off ad hoc and unsystematic. And we've had, let's think, in the case of the US, so we have Fed stroke government guarantees for Bear Stearns, $29 billion. Treasury reprivatizations, deprivatization of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, about $200 billion. Nationalization of AIG, $85 billion. The Paulson Plan, $700 billion. The US swap facility, $620 billion. It starts to sound, if you like, it's a bit like a perverse ad for MasterCard. Seeing the global financial system fall to its knees, and the Bush administration described as socialism, priceless for everything else as a government bailout. I mean, the world looks different. The world has changed. The way we think about the world functioning has changed. But temporary bans on short selling. And there's a sort of a nice irony here, of course, which several people have already pointed out, that as the US and the UK and others start to institute short selling bans, the Chinese are actually liberalizing their stock market on the other side of the world and saying, oh, maybe short selling is actually quite good. It's a way of finding price disclosure. Balance sheets for developed country central banks, they start to take off all those high-quality assets and swap them for basically what's been described as toxic junk. Now, I remember when I was doing development economics back at university, I was told you can always spot a developing country central bank balance sheet because you look at it and it'll have a load of crap on it, which it shouldn't. Now you look at the balance sheet of the Federal Reserve or the Bank of England and you say, oh, that's what I was taught to think of as what a third world central bank balance sheet looked like. It has a lot of crap on it. So the way that, again, sort of the assumptions about how things played out look very different. But the sort of the ultimate response, I guess, is this sort of partial or effective nationalization. Governments have decided that in the end, infrequent, temporary ad hoc measures weren't enough. You had to do this systemically. You had to do it systemically by guaranteeing liabilities. So not just deposits, but also loans, which is pretty striking. And you had to do it by recapitalizing the banks, and you did that by pumping in government capital. And the model that sort of took off was the UK government model, which is basically, as far as I can tell, based, or at least a variant of the Swedish model that was used in the early 1990s. And if you look at that, it really does tell you about something important about the balancing of government versus state power, government versus market power. You look at the terms of that. The government buys preference shares and injects capital in. In return, they get paid reasonably well. They get their 12% dividend. They get to appoint 2 to 3 Treasury directors that sit on the board. The CEOs of the 3 biggest institutions who are effectively bailed out by this fall on their swords and are gone. There are caps on executive pay. There are restrictions on bonuses. There are restrictions or limits on saying that you can't pay out dividends. And there are requirements for lending. There are lending targets. And again, flashback to development economics, you can always spot a repressed third world development banking system because you have directed lending where the government tells its banks who's it's going to lend to and how much. Well, that's what the UK government, that's the business that the UK government is now in. It's in it at one end of that extreme. It's a fairly moderate end of that extreme, but it's now back in that business, which it hasn't been since,